I sat in a cell and read law books. I then studied the Constitution. Virtually all of the best books from the prison library were in my cell. I could see that the prison system was abusing prisoners. So therefore, I got the prisoners together and said, do you understand that we have prison law in this country, and we can do judicial reviews, etc. They started to listen to me because we was all being banged up 23 and a half hours a day, right? And as they did, I started to use the law and the system, and in the end, the system started to obey us, not the other way around. So you should see the prison rules and prison regulations a bit like the Constitution. Once you know what it is and you club together and say, this is what we need to do, then you can hold the bad players to account. And that's what I was doing in the prison system.
So how did we get where we are, Graham? I mean, I moved to America in 1991. I was an immigrant, and America was good to me. And a healthy amount of people coming into the country is good for the economy. It doesn't derail national identity. But then all of a sudden, here in the UK, I came back in, December 2007. It just seems after that, there was a real acceleration of unfettered immigration. How did we get to where we are? And, you know, symptoms of that are the criminality that we're seeing, the gangs of London, the grooming gangs. It's fed into that as well. But what were the root causes of this from the get-go?
I have to be a bit careful what I say on this show. We have reversed engineered. And when I say we, there is a group of us. Reversed engineered every law that they put in place. And it goes back really until 1812. So if you know anything about history, and certainly the War of Independence, so from 1776, the British had been beaten. The British only existed from 1706, 1707. England existed from 927 and technically still exists, although we are being crushed. And the people crushing us are actually the British oligarch or the British ruling class or the British cabal, right? And they suckered in the working class. And I'll give you an example. There's a group out there called the Fabian Society. The Fabian Society are committed Marxists. They were the people that were funded by the Rockefellers, the Rothschilds, and various other groups, industrialists, pharmaceuticals, etc. And it was to suck in what they could see was the uncontrollable working class. And they did that via the Fabian Society created a political party called the Labour Party. And that's where the real stench of corruption come in. There was a particular law, it was called the Parliament Act of 1911. That was pushed through by the Fabian Society and another group called Sinn Féin. And that changed the way we were governed because it started to pay politicians, and they was warned at the time by very good politicians and honest politicians, don't do this because you're going to create a political class. And that's exactly what happened. But if you go back through history, you'll see that there were certain points in history where, again, in 1812, the British attacked the United States of America and they lost again. And then they realized they had to remove the British. The British had to remove the English system and the common law and the common law constitution, right? And they started to chip away. So the first real effects of that you can feel from the Oath Act, which was in 1857, I believe it was. And then another act was put in place, very similar, called the Jews Relief Act. And the reason why I talk about that was because it was extremely serious what they did. And they in effect removed the Christian oath and allowed anyone to be a member of parliament, House of Lords, or in the judiciary, within the next year, a person called Rothschild was elected from the City of London into Parliament, right? So because of them acts, he was elected into Parliament. Within 10 years, they had started to dismantle the English Constitution and the constitutional protections that were put in place by our ancestors. There are many, many, many of these things, but one of them is called the British Nationality Act. And again, if you read history and you read Hansard, you can see in 1670, we were warned, don't do this. So even in our English Parliament, they tried to do this. And what they tried to do was protect Protestants, European Protestants, and they opened the gateway to them. So this is nothing to do with race. It's technically nothing to do with religion per se. But in doing that, they started to flood the gates. And what happened was that politicians succeeded in stopping mass immigration in 1670. Unfortunately, in 1708, they passed the British Nationality Act. And then within 3 years, they realised they'd made a serious error and they made it null and void and they stopped it. And then we started to get a slight recovery. So there is a whole history of legal history. I'm not talking about normal kings and queens and who was having an affair with who and who's an illegitimate child and who isn't. I'm not interested in that. What I'm interested in is what actually happened and what created the mess we're in now. And that's why we say the Constitution is the solution.
So it's fascinating that there are such, ancient, deep roots to this. What is the reasonably recent story? Let's just go back the last decade or so as to how we've seen, the immigration go on a slope like this to just go hyperbolic.
Well, so the major point to that, first of all, our constitutional laws are law, right? They are the foundation of this country, the same as in the United States of America. But if you want to look at the most recent things, you need to look at, firstly, and I always say this to people, we lost the Second World War. And the reason that we did was because we sided with the Soviet Union that then infiltrated the British, right, in a big way. It was also acknowledged by General Button, I think his name was. I can't remember his last name now on the tip of my tongue. But he basically said the same thing. A number of people said the same thing. That doesn't mean that you're siding with the Nazis. It's saying that the actual enemy was the Soviet Union, right? And it was a group of people called Bolsheviks. So from that, in 1981, they created something called the British Nationalities Act. And what that did was erased English, Scottish, Welsh, and Irish national identities and replaced it with British, which is internationally unlawful, but they did that. The person who did that was a lady called Margaret Thatcher. And the person who did that prior to her was someone called Joseph Stalin, who was the Commissar of Identity with the USSR, and he created something called Soviet. So when you hear British, you need to think Soviet, because that's what it is. Then they progressed further than that, and Tony Blair took control. And once he had taken control, they created something called the Constitutional Reform Act of 2005, which was unlawful, right? And there were many provisions of that. There were other provisions also in the Coroners Act of 2009 that chipped away in different variations at our rights. And they never told the people. That's the crucial thing, is they must tell the people what they're doing. Even Sir John Laws, who was the judge who dealt with the Metric Martyr case, had said that, right? So it's really important that people understand that the Constitutional Reform Act is serious. It undermines the foundation of our nation. But there was something that they did on two occasions. Once in 1868, they repealed part of the English Bill of Rights, and it was ultra-vires. They weren't allowed to do it, and they lied to people, and they did it by stealth. And that was Section 3 of the original Bill of Rights. They weren't allowed to touch it. And again, that was 10 years after they elected Rothschild. And then in 1947, they top and tailed Section 2 of the, or Chapter 2, whatever you want to just, of the English Bill of Rights. And they made themselves, Parliament, by taking these two parts out, they made themselves sovereign. They lied to everyone. They cheated people. They didn't tell people the truth. And they did that just after the Second World War, which fits in with the fact that we lost the Second World War, because they changed that crucial element. So there are lots of things. And then what they started to do, which possibly gets onto the subject of tonight, is they started to allocate billions of pounds to a company called Mears Group, and a company called Serco, and a company called Clear Springs. And what they started to do after that, they for the first time ever in 2011, they put into the census English only national identity, and everyone who's English cheered. They're finally recognizing the English, but you shouldn't have been cheering, because there was a reason why they did that. They needed to know where you was in England. And from that census and from them statistics, they then started to flood, using the 4 billion of your tax money, the areas with the highest national identity of England. They also did that with Northern Ireland. They also did that with Wales. They also did that with Scotland. And the money that they're receiving is your tax money that is being laundered into these 3 major companies. And how I first found out about that was because I worked for Mears Group. And I noticed that my manager was in meetings. This was in 2016, 2017. He had just been taken away from the management of the group and made a project manager. Now, what I thought was strange, very strange, was he started off as a forklift driver. It was very Soviet in the way it was done. He started off as a forklift driver, and then all of a sudden, as a project manager, he was paid well in excess of £100,000 a year. And everyone thought, how fantastic, as the working class man, he's doing so well. And what he was actually doing in 2016 and 17 was going round to all of the military barracks that were in disrepair. Mears Group was given the funding via this, and this was prior to 2019, right? This was in 2016, 2017. So this is a long-term situation. It didn't suddenly happen. And they was given the funding to repair these barracks because they were putting asylum seekers in there. They knew the asylum seekers were coming years in advance. And basically, I started to speak to a number of people there, and I was then sacked. The point I'm trying to make to people is, I've been telling people for years, this didn't just suddenly happen. It was planned. It was planned for. They never told you. They've used your tax money to do this and to house people. And all the time they had them billions available, instead of housing our own homeless people that were dying on the streets, freezing cold, they was allocating this money to these groups of asylum seekers who just happen to be young, fighting age men. But there's something else about this, and that is that a lot of these people are now being employed as SIA, security firm employees. And because of our rights to self-defense, all that is needed is the chief constable, and again, I've shown this to people, is to authorize their firearms certificates, and then they're armed against you. And that's exactly what's going to happen. So everything that I've said in the past and showed people this is what's happening. What they don't like is someone like me, and what I mean by that is a normal everyday working class person who has read law for 30 years, studied our constitution, is actually showing people this is what they've planned for years. It is treason, and they are conducting an invasion of this nation.
Wow, Graham, that is absolutely terrifying, and we appreciate your deep research on this. What is the end game for these people who've diabolically planned this out for so long?
The end game is the full, complete destruction of England. They have succeeded in destroying Scotland, and they have been conned into believing that that they can go back into the European Union. They are currently, so Scotland, they removed the constabularies of Scotland. There were several of them, and they've created in effect a regional state police force. They don't have what they have is a regional assembly. They don't have a dissolved parliament or a devolved parliament or any of them things. They haven't got a parliament, right? That's just a big con. There is a way that the Scots can deal with it, and I've already spoke to them up there, and no one's pushed forward on it. So I believe that they intend to carry on with the Union because they want to destroy England. So the end game, Karl Marx hated England with a vengeance. One of his colleagues wrote a letter, and in that letter he said that every communist revolution has been shipwrecked on the rock of England. He didn't say Britain, he said England, because Britain isn't a country. In effect, Britain itself is an island, and it contained, the reason it was called Great Britain was because it contained three nations, right? So the three nations are England, Scotland, and Wales. Even though Wales is currently a principality, people need to understand that their end game is to regionalise England, which they're currently succeeding with. London is a region of the European Union. It has an assembly, no different to the Scottish Assembly. The person in charge of that assembly is Sadiq Khan, who I arrested and we arrested on January the 13th, 2018. The world's press saw that, it was live, and we arrested him for subverting the English constitution. And then we called the police, and of course the police turned up. It was all on camera, which actually you can still find it on YouTube. The point being that these people, the end game, as you put it, is to destroy England. And part of that process is to brainwash people to believe that they are British, not English, not Scottish, not Welsh, and not Irish. And the reason is because they need the regionalisation, and then you are drawn into the European Union again, which is what Keir Starmer is currently doing. And one of the things that he's doing with the European Defence Union that they have always denied, which we have. And again, there's a really great guy out there, David Ellis, that has spoken to people on numerous occasions and said, listen, they're planning this, they're doing it, and they're doing it without telling you. And part of that is conscription, and part of it is to push our younger generations into a meat grinder with Russia.
So we'll get to that. So Scott, who is watching, has asked, why do they hate us native English people so much?
Because the only thing that they cannot defeat, and they know that, is the English common law constitution. It is inviolable. You have absolute rights from God. America. So one of the things I'll say to that, to Scott, is that we anglicised America, not the other way around. So we're not becoming Americanized. We anglicised America. America is a replica of England from the 1600s. And when people recognise that, if you've been out there, Sean, yourself, I've been to America a number of times. I worked out in America. The system is an old English system. And the reason why they became the most powerful nation in the world and the best nation in the world to live in is because they abided by the English common law. right? So even their Supreme Court today uses English common law in their precedents. Hellier case, for example, Justice Scalia, in the right to keep and bear arms, actually stated that that these rights, our Second Amendment, comes from the English Bill of Rights, and it was a pre-existing right in England. So getting back to why do they hate us so much, it is because of the English common law constitution. And the key thing that the English, right, don't allow is we don't allow fascism, we don't allow communism, and we don't allow monopolies. And because of that, they need to crush us. We are the beating heart of the United States of America.
So the next question is from Kat. And Kat is asking, isn't this treason, what you are describing?
It is treason. And again, we have a separation of powers in England, although many people out there will tell you we haven't. If you go on to the Sprinkle,